Welcome everyone to the first episode of my Era's Tour of Horror series. I was originally just gonna throw a few different decades into one video, but then I realized, I could actually do way more with this concept than just trying to fit everything into one video. So this is episode 1, and essentially I'm going to go through the eras of horror, decade by decade, starting with 1900 and moving my way through the years up to the present day. I'm going to try and read 2 horror books in each episode. One that might be a bit more obscure, one that's probably a bit more popular that I haven't read yet, just to see how horror progresses from the last 100 years, and hopefully to see if I can find some new favourites too. So in episode 1, the decade that I'm exploring is 1900 to 1909. It's actually kind of hard to find horror novels during this time because a lot of the horror was conveyed through short stories and anthologies, and I don't really want to tackle short stories and anthologies, but in some of these videos I might have to. Just like the first story that I'm reading in this video, which is The Willows by Algernon and Blackwood. This one is a short story. It is 38 pages long. It does have tiny writing, so it might count as a novella, maybe, or a novelette. I'm not 100% sure. But this was one from this decade that I really had my eye on and really wanted to try out, as well as The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. Now, I personally never heard of either of these authors, so it'll be really interesting to see what I end up thinking of these, if I vibe with early 20th century horror, or maybe it'll just blow up in my face, who knows. So if you want to join me on this adventure through the eras of horror, then don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you end up enjoying it. Even though it's 8 PM here, I'm still having coffee. I have a long night ahead of me tonight. It's actually been a couple of days since I finished The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, and I want to read out some passages to you, but also know that I'm not going to spoil anything. There's not going to be any plot spoilers, even though it's like so small and tiny. The writing is not, and this did take a good minute to finish. But honestly, this was so well written, and one of the things that I love about any kind of book from like over 100 years ago and longer is that they are always so beautifully written. And even if half the time I don't understand what I'm reading, I still appreciate how lyrical the prose is. And I just want to read some things out here, so take a seat. This is about 2 friends who are on a canoe trip, and one night they get off the river and go into the, I think it was called the Black Forest, to kind of set up camp. But it seems like this forest is alive. I absolutely love how, even though this doesn't have a whole lot of plot, the idea that the author can personify the trees and make them feel alive and also threatening. And it makes it feel like the setting is another character in itself. So let me just go through some things I absolutely love. Yeah, like even just like the second paragraph, I was like, oh my god, I love how alive this feels. These willows never attain to the dignity of trees. They have no rigid trunks. They remain humble bushes, with rounded tops and soft outline, swaying on slender stems that answer to the least pressure of the wind, supple as grasses, and so continually shifting that they somehow give the impression that the entire plain is moving and alive. For the wind sends waves rising and falling over the whole surface, waves of leaves instead of waves of water. Green swells like the sea too, until the branches turn and lift, and then silvery white as their underside turns to the sun. It's just like, this is a bougie bitch. I could not take this on a date because I would feel inferior. This book is too good for me, you know what I mean? The sense of remoteness from the world of humankind, the utter isolation, the fascination of this singular world of willows, winds and waters. Oh my god. It's been a long time since I've read a classic or anything that came out before, I would want to say the 90s. I think the 90s is the latest that I've read this year. It's definitely been well over a year or more since I read a classic. I think the last classic I read was maybe Dracula in September 2022. It's now October 2023. So just kind of this, like, earlier this year I read Get in My Swamp by J.M. Ferry, which was Shrek porn. I think that's like the closest I can get with a comparison of having this setting that is like almost swamp-like. So I mean, definitely different. Just prose. So even though we don't really get to see a whole lot, what we are given in terms of the description of the landscape and the trees and what the characters talk about too is enough to give you an unsettling feeling, and the vagueness just makes it that much more sinister. With the multitude of willows, however, it was something far different, I felt. Some essence emanated from them that besieged the heart, a sense of awe awakened, true, but of awe touched somewhere by a vague terror. Their serried ranks growing everywhere darker about me as unwelcome suggestion that we had trespassed here upon the borders of an alien world, a world where we were intruders, a world where we were not wanted or invited to remain. Yeah, there is something that comes back towards the end that happens pretty early on that I didn't think too much of, but it made for a really great ending. It took a while actually, because I really wanted to take in everything that was written on the page, and it made me go a bit slower when I'm reading. Classics usually do. They teach me to wait, and my patience is usually rewarded by giving me this beautiful story. Well, I wouldn't say like the story was like beautiful in the sense that, oh, it's an aesthetically pleasing kind of thing, but more along the sense of this was hauntingly beautiful, you know what I mean? But by making myself slow down and take in each word made me appreciate the story that much more. And one thing that I really found myself doing too much of this year was speeding through books just to get the books read. And I allowed myself for the first time in forever, in the words of Anna from Frozen, to actually take in the story and let it be. In the words, I'm kidding. Twilight was enough to smoke and see each other's faces by, and the sparks flew about overhead like fireworks. A few yards beyond, the river gurgled and hissed, and from time to time a heavy splash announced the falling away of further portions of the bank. Like, honestly, nothing, well, barely anything really actually happens, and I genuinely do not care. There are so many books that I read where I care if it is so plotless or nothing happens. I find them boring and tedious. But having the suspense made it one of the kind of best sorts of horrors that I've read in recent times. A lot of times I think horror wants to try to go all out in scaring us or giving us that jump scare or tries to force something to happen to scare us, but sometimes nothing really needs to happen to scare us. One thing that I've really learned from going to my haunted location visits in the vlog series that I do is that sometimes I scare myself when nothing is happening. Like, a lot of it's my imagination and my own feelings that are making me scared. So just judging from like the one tiny short story that I've read of something that came out in the 1900s, I feel like horror back then was a bit more, well, I don't want to say tasteful, because there's so much horror these days that I love, like films, books that are tasteful, but I think I've been a bit used to having the jump scary kind of horror that I find the less that happens, the better. Quality over quantity. But yeah, so many incredible instances of the author personifying the surroundings and keeping me invested. I even wrote at one point that this is very Blair Witch. There are little elements of, you know, the feelings that you get while watching Blair Witch Project, and that's a horror film that I really like. So yeah, I was feeling the moments from that. And one of the things I love about the Blair Witch Project is that a lot of it you do have to fill in the blanks yourself. You have to use your imagination because it doesn't show you everything. I mean, not that I think the Blair Witch Project was inspired by this. Maybe it was, I don't know. But I see those influences in, by not showing us everything, it makes it that much more sinister and makes for a more impactful ending too. It was honestly great. I don't think I can talk too much more about it without going into spoiler territory. So hopefully I mentioned enough to give you a sense of this. But this is what I wanted. This is what I wanted to come away from reading horror from this time period and doing this series of going through each era of horror so that I can see how it progresses. And I know obviously like horror existed before this too. I don't really know why I chose 1900 onwards, but I did. Maybe I might do some episodes where I go further back, because I do love gothic fiction from like the 1790s, for instance. But this has already given me a sense of what to expect from this time period. And while I don't really love short stories in themselves, because I do find them a bit too short, but I do think this was the perfect length to keep that tension throughout. And honestly, this might be one of my favourite reads of the year. However, do bear in mind that I've barely read anything that great this year anyway, so the bar is quite low, but I do genuinely think that this was a great read. And if you like something a bit short and punchy, this might be the one for you. And look at the next book I have to read. Have you seen how old this is? This is like such an old book. Ooh, yeah, it's old. Ooh, yeah, it's old. The House on the Borderland made me realise that I need to read way more in this genre for me to be able to understand a lot of the things that happen. I will say though, I did really enjoy this. I just felt like, especially by the second half of this book, that I didn't really know a whole lot of what was going on, because I've never read things that include cosmic horror for instance. So this is definitely the first time I've ever experienced something like that. And what it did was it made me feel the need to have to research a little bit more to understand the text by that point. I think the first half of this book was definitely more suspenseful than what comes after. And I appreciate the fact that it is a text that made me have to engage with it a little bit deeper, with a little bit more meaning. And I've never really done that since uni, for instance, and I miss doing stuff like that. I miss being able to get intimate with a book and find out more about the themes and the messages through the lens of other people, especially a book that deals with genres that I've never touched before. So The House on the Borderland, it begins with two fishermen, and they end up coming across this abandoned house, and inside this house they find this manuscript, and it turns out to be the diary of a guy whose name we never find out, but it's essentially more a diary, and then we get into this like monologue kind of format of this story where we are now transported however far back into the past. Yeah, the fishermen find this text, which is about the strange tale of the house on the borderland. For such was the title of the manuscript that is told in the following pages. And then yeah, it goes into this diary format of the elderly man who lived there and the really weird and strange stuff that he experiences there. And one thing that really got me, and again, I don't want to do any spoilers or anything like that, but what got me is like there were these like swine monsters or like swine things that would attack, and I think that's where a lot of the suspense and horror comes from. Speaking as a modern day reader who is such an amateur when it comes to the kinds of horror we do explore, that to me came across as very, very well done, and I loved all of the like the first half of this. And I think if I had have understood more by the time we got to the cosmic side of things, then I would have probably enjoyed the second half of this a lot more than I did. So like the mood of the story is very solemn and isolating and very atmospheric in a way that really did grip me in that first half. And also I love the idea of framing the narrative within a narrative, and it reminds me a little bit of like House of Leaves in a way, which I have read and enjoyed, but that book as well like confused the life out of me. But the narrative within a narrative is something that I really enjoy. Actually, I think one of my favourite gothic classics, The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, it has been a while since I read it, but I believe that one begins with a found manuscript. So I know everything about the writing. I think the writing is fantastic, but there's just so much about like the sun and visions and the eternal and things that I'm just like, I'm not smart enough for that. And it's very trippy, I guess. Very, very trippy. In fact, it made me want to go onto YouTube and watch things about the universe, which is something that I do find interesting every now and then when I'm having a bit of an existential crisis. I look into like, oh, like how big is the universe, and like how did the universe even begin, and things to do with like the stars and the cosmos and just weird and intense things like that that make you feel even smaller and more insignificant as a human being. I feel like it does a good job at doing that, almost like broadening the horizon and expanding your mind. And it really makes me very interested in reading more cosmic horror, or even like try my first H.P. Lovecraft or something of that ilk. So I feel like this is one that I should revisit once I've kind of read around the subject of this book in the hopes that I can understand it better. That's the only kind of worry that I have about this series of like doing the Era's Tour of Horror, is that the earlier books, I am a little bit worried that I might not be able to understand or really grasp them in the way that I really want to, but I will make the conscious effort of doing like research and delving into the text. I love classics though. I love things like this. It's just, I don't know. One thing that this story lacks is character. And I feel like that's probably purposeful from the author, because we are getting this almost monologue type narrative. We are going through his like diary manuscript of the House of the Borderland. And this 80-year-old man, was he 80 or just elderly? I might have made up the 80. This elderly man, and we don't really learn a whole lot about him. We don't even know his name. We don't know much. And yeah, there is a dog called Pepper. And let's just say I love that dog more than anything. I am really glad I read this though. I will try more from this author and more in this field so that my knowledge and appreciation can just develop from here. But that is 2 stories from 1900 to 1909 done. I can't believe how short this vlog is going to be. So I think in the future I might end up doing 3 books from each decade instead of just 2, especially when one of them is like as short as this one and the other one is as strange as this one was. I've learned a lot. I have learned a lot, and moving forward as well, I'm looking forward to seeing how horror develops and grows from what I've just experienced. I feel like the 2 stories together, I don't know if it's a reflection of 1900 to 1909 or anything like that, but there is definitely a lot more thought and a lot more of like internalness to the stories, in our connection to the world, to Earth, to nature. Some of it is quite psychological, I've realised, and a lot of vagueness when it comes to what the actual horror is supposed to be. One thing I will say about The House on the Borderland is when we start to get into trying to explain what's going on, that's when it also kind of lost me a little bit. So I do appreciate, like, say, The Willows, which was much shorter, so of course, it used less words to show what it is that we are supposed to be scared of. It's a bit like The Willows, like both of these stories aren't too outward in what it's trying to do. House on the Borderland had to give us a little bit more considering it's a 139-page book. I much appreciate the subtleness and the ambiguity of The Willows. And I guess the punchiness too. It does feel, you know, comparing the two together, that this one does get to the point a little bit quicker and a little bit faster and a little bit better. Whereas The House on the Borderland, yeah, it does have to drag it a little bit more. And so there were more words to fill the page with. But yeah, I think as soon as we started getting into that territory of trying to explain things, I was like, you know what, I would much prefer to not see or like to not know exactly what it is that I'm supposed to be scared of here. Because I think Fear of the Unknown, which I still think this did very well, is a lot more effective than knowing what it is we're up against. So these two definitely encapsulated the fear of the unknown and not giving us too much that it takes away too much of that terror. And I can't wait to do more of these and to see how horror develops from there. So I do have potentially The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux in the next video, with The Testament of Magdalene Blair by Aleister Crowley. I might try and find another book from that decade to also fill in, unless you have some recommendations, not just for potentially the next video, but the ones after that. If there's any particular horror stories you think will be quite important for me to tackle with each era, whether they were like really influential or ones that are so underrated that they should be appreciated by a modern day audience. I'm looking for a mixture of both if possible. So yeah, that's my plan for the next one. Hopefully we'll get to each decade up until the present day. And yeah, I'm so sorry how short this video was. But hey, this is just the pilot, and who knows, maybe I might not get picked up for a second episode. You'll have to like and subscribe to find out. But yeah, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave all your comments down below. What did you think of the video? Have you read either of the stories that I read in this video? Tell me your thoughts, tell me your feelings, tell me your opinions down in the comments. I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons and my One Piece channel members for supporting my channel. If you'd like to join my Patreon or my One Piece channel membership, then all the links are down in the description box. But yeah, I hope I will see you in the next video. Bye!